everybody. I'm Barbara Peters, and our guest today for a virtual event is Kate White, an old friend. I say old in the sense of longtime acquaintance rather than actually elderly, right, Kate?
Well, I don't know about that. My lips are sealed on myself.
Okay. Kate and I have spent time together here at the Poison Pen, but one memorable day when she was still the editor of Cosmo, I got to spend at least, I think it was half a day at Cosmo, which I have to say was one of the most interesting experiences of my whole life. Do you miss being at the magazine?
Barbara, I had 14 fantastic years there. It was just as much as like being on a television show as you can imagine. It was just so much fun. The people who worked for me were kind of over the top because why else would you work for Cosmo? And they were so much fun. We had a really diverse staff. I loved it, but I knew at one point I wanted to write thrillers and suspense full time. I'd written eight while I was there, and I saved my pennies so I would be able to do that. And I had enough time to think about making the decision. I gave them 2 years' notice that turned into three. So I had plenty of time to sort of savor it. And by the time I left, I was ready. In fact, one of the last people I saw when I was there was Harlan Coben. He and I were going to have a cup of coffee, and he said, "Oh, why don't I just come by your office?" And he came by, and so that was like a perfect sign of moving on to another genre. Totally.
Who was the young man that worked for you that did book reviews and also became a very well known author? I am completely blanking out on who he was.
That's John Searles, and we spent an hour and a half yesterday catching up on the phone. He was my work husband. My husband allowed it, and he was just he's such a fabulous guy. And he just handed in for William Morrow his next novel, and so I can't wait to read it at some point. He's a really terrific author and such a great person too. And he did book reviews for us and appeared on the Today Show doing book reviews, and I think your paths crossed at a couple of different points, right?
Yes, they did. I was a big fan of his books and sent them to him to sign. And then on the memorable day that I spent at Cosmo, he was there. Can you remind me what was the deal when like there would be an emergency and everything would stop? And I got caught up in that at least twice in the course of that day.
Oh, do you think that the maybe it was just a fire alarm?
No, no, no. It was to do with producing the magazine. There would be like this, all of a sudden everybody would freeze, and it would be some kind of like rush to get together to solve something.
Maybe it would be something like I remember one of the worst nightmares I had there. We were the biggest selling magazine on the newsstand, single copy sales in the U.S. And I had taken it to number one and kept it there. And my bosses expected me to keep it there. And I had got Lady Gaga to agree to a cover, and she hadn't done many covers yet. And I got a call from her record company saying, no, the shoot that's going to happen 2 weeks from now, well, she's just not feeling great these days, and she's not going to do it. I'm like, whoa, 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 no, no, you can't pull out. I don't have any other covers. And I had to use everything in my arsenal to secure that cover. And she shot it, and it was a great seller for us. So probably maybe you were there, Barbara, the day my assistant ran up and whispered in my ear, Lady Gaga wants to pull out of the cover. So that probably would have made me run back to my office, scramble back, and go, okay, I better get busy here.
Well, it was something like that. Before we stop dishing on this, I have one more question to ask you. When my husband and I took the Crystal trip in 2017 through the Northwest Passage, which was really exciting, they showed all these interesting movies. And one of them was called The First Monday in May. And Rob didn't want to go and see it with me, but I said, no, you'll really like it. And it turns out, that it was a documentary of the Metropolitan Museum's annual May 1st fundraiser, and it was their Chinese exhibit. but what they went through to get people like Lady Gaga to attend and to do seating charts and all. And so I wonder, did you ever go to one of those?
And in fact, I went to the one that Lady Gaga sang at, and my table was so close to her, and it was just so clear how monstrously talented she is. I just love her. In the early days, it wasn't as expensive. I think maybe it was like $5,000 a ticket. And I would always say to my boss, look, I have to go, have to mix. There was one year where I managed to book four covers that night. I just, I would bump into someone like Kate Hudson and sort of schmooze a little. And my favorite moment of all was I had done some things with Hillary Clinton. I gave a luncheon at the White House with her when I was the editor of Red Book, and I met her a couple times. And the Clintons are famous for remembering people's names. I think they use some of those techniques, those strategies. And I was running to the ladies' room, and I was running by a side door, and all of a sudden I see what's clearly security. And Hillary Clinton was senator then, but she had the kind of security you have from having been first lady. And the door opens, and she walks in. And because she's always Hillary in my head, I go, Hillary, hi, you just got here. And I think, oh my gosh, I've called her Hillary. I'm not kidding. She goes, Kate, how are you? Oh my gosh, that's pretty amazing that she would remember my name. She'd only met me a couple of times, and I was just so struck. And I said, listen, I apologize for calling you Hillary. She said, oh, please call me Hillary. But I would never make that mistake again.
I was interested to see, I just finished our May newsletter, the second half, that Curtis Sittenfeld, I think her name is, has written a book called Rodham, and the premise is to imagine what Hillary's life would have been like if she hadn't married Bill. And I thought to myself, why? Why would you write that book, and why would you even want to imagine it?
Well, it is interesting. There was a documentary I saw on Hillary Clinton, and it talks about her being in Washington, and Bill had gone off to Arkansas to try to make it in politics there. And I think there was a period where she was at a crossroads. And of course, what was her other book about Laura Bush that was so interesting? And I thought this one sounded interesting too. I'll probably read it. I think she's such a good writer.
Well, she is a good writer. I think she did something, one of the Jane Austen carry-ons or something. But anyway, I figured that the one cover you didn't try to book was with Anna Wintour, who I have to say was the star of One Monday in May, as she would be. She's still the editor at Vogue, isn't she?
Yes, but the magazine business is just such a sad state these days, because even before our pandemic, women who are, I'm talking specifically about fashion and beauty magazines and young women's magazines, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, they don't read print, and you just can't do the same thing on a website that you can do in print. So it's changing, and I think change is exciting. It's part of life. But for me, I didn't really want to be around when it was all falling apart, because it had been so great to be there during the golden years. So something else that influenced my decision to leave, besides the fact that I'd written these 8 books and loved it and wanted to give myself a chance to do that, I didn't want to be in magazines when it was all unraveling like it is today.
Well, I'm glad it's been a successful pivot, is the new fancy word, pivot for you. So you wrote a number of books about Bailey Wiggins, and now you have pivoted off to do a standalone, which is really a terrific book. Unfortunately, all of our copies are, I mentioned this, those of you who might like to buy one, Kate has signed and shipped to us copies of her new book, so we can't show you one. But why don't you, do you have one there?
Wonderful.
Can you hold one up? There it is.
Yeah. um, yeah, well, I love writing Bailey Wiggins books, and I have one come out last year that just got nominated for an International Thriller Writer Award. It's called Such a Perfect Wife. But I also wanted to try standalones, and there's something exciting about doing those and having a new character to work with, new characters, and just seeing what kinds of crazy things a new set of characters can get up to, and the ways they might kill each other too,
I
or
like
torture each other.
Sure. I like the
Ways.
fact that when this particular book, which I'm really sorry that we can't have compelled everybody to read it before we talk about it because it's just so cool the way it ends up. But I think it's a story that when you've told this particular story about Allie Linden, it's done, and then the reader should imagine, what might come next, and an advantage to a standalone. You don't have to set it up for a future book.
Right. And what I like about this too is that you, with Allie at the end, she's making some decisions and she hasn't made them yet. She's in that process. And so you get to kind of imagine what will happen to her. When you're writing a series, as the Bailey Wagon series is, you sort of know at the conclusion of every book, probably in a sense, what's going to happen to Bailey. She's going to be okay. She's going to have her head screwed on right. And so it's interesting to leave a little bit more to the imagination sometimes with a standalone when you end it. Not to say that it isn't important to answer the reader's questions for them and solve the murder or solve the crisis that happens and wrap it up so people aren't left like, wait, why did that happen? But still, with the main character, you get to imagine a bit more about how her life will evolve from there.
It's very much a Gone with the Wind ending when, Scarlett heads off for Tara and we all try to imagine what her future might be. I think that's very true.
What did you imagine? Did you imagine that she would get back with Rhett Butler? I told myself she would.
I don't know. I mean, but that's the point of the ending, is that you can not only write your own, but you can keep writing your own.
Right. Perhaps the way I wanted it to end when I was young is different than how I would want it to end now. Perhaps I would want it to end with her just going off, be her own woman, starting a big company and becoming really successful.
Right, sewing more clothes out of the drapes. Who knows? But anyway, so let's talk about Allie. The first thing I would love to know is, do you think this is a book that could have taken place any place but New York City?
I think it could have, yes. But for me, I like to set some of my books in New York. The one that I just handed in is set out in Pennsylvania, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. It's sort of a locked door suspense novel. But I like to set books in New York, but not have the Statue of Liberty rising up in the background, but just to give a taste of New York so you realize you're in a big city that has a certain texture to it. Things happen because you are in a big city. You might have more of a sense that somebody's watching you or following you. And I give a little taste of New York by having her walk by Lincoln Center one day, or she lives in a high-rise apartment building, so she can see the city and all those silver gray buildings out the window. But I don't hit you over the head with it. But I do think in this case, a city felt like the right place for her to live.
Oh, I definitely agree. I felt it was very much a story that would happen in New York, certainly would not happen in Phoenix for a whole lot of reasons. So we meet Allie. She has gone up to her office and discovers to her horror and dismay that her key card will not swipe. And she's baffled by that. I thought that was, in a way, a real New York moment, although I suppose every corporate headquarters anymore is like that. And so that's the setup. What happens to her when she's standing there confused about why her card doesn't work?
Well, somebody lets her in, and that would also happen in a big city because she doesn't recognize this one guy who comes off the elevator after her, and she's early, and she explains to him, and she thinks she's been away, and she just says, hey, I can't get in. He goes, I'll let you in. And she gives her name. And that can sometimes happen too, particularly with people a certain age. They think, oh, this person isn't breaking in. They just have screwed up with her key card. So he lets her in, and then she realizes she's one of the few people at this financial, sort of like a little bit of personal finance news uh, website called Greenbacks. She's high up and she's got her own office. She's a head of content, and she doesn't have the key to her office either. So she goes into the conference room with the idea that she'll wait till the office manager gets in, and all of a sudden she sees the guy who runs the company. He's young, in his 30s, late 30s, come in, and he sees her in the conference room, and he comes in, and he goes, "What are you doing here?" And she goes, "Why, do you need the room?" And he goes, "No, you haven't worked here in 5 years." And at that point, she begins to realize she has no idea of anything that happened before she arrived there that moment. And she ends up fainting and being taken to an ER, a psychiatric ER, and she's told she's in this fugue state. Most of her memory comes back except for 2 days. And so she knows something happened to her during those 2 days. Her husband doesn't know where she was. They'd had a fight, so he thought she'd just taken off. And she finds some bloody tissues, dried blood, in her trench coat pocket, and she begins to realize something bad happened in those 2 days, and somebody doesn't want her to know what it is.
So in addition, you had to face up to that thing we all have to face up as writers anymore, is where's her cell phone and why doesn't she have it?
Yeah, right. She doesn't have her cell phone, and she can find out through Find Your Phone the last place she had it, but that isn't telling her anything. And so what she wants to do is try to figure out where she was. She hires a private detective because she thinks it's important. She's nervous, and then she also starts going to a therapist who she's been going to, but because she and her husband have been talking about trying to conceive, and all of a sudden she's got cold feet, and she's not sure why. And there's an incident that happened in her past that she thinks may be making her a little nervous about being a mother. So she's been going to this therapist. So of course she goes to the therapist and says this other thing happened. And so the therapist says, "Look, we've got to play detective here and try to figure out, trigger your memory, figure out where you were." So she got these two players helping her, the private detective and the therapist. And she gathers more and more information that ends up scaring her because it becomes clear somebody doesn't want her to know what she was up to during those 2 days.
Well, I think we probably can't say any more without spoiling it. I love the idea that she hired a private detective to investigate herself. I thought that was really a great way to go since, since she hasn't got any memory, she does need somebody to try to sleuth um, sleuth out what she was doing and uncover her tracks.
What I found so interesting, Barbara, I called it a couple private eyes when I was doing research. And well, first of all, I learned a lot of them just don't work in offices anymore because they can do everything through the internet. And Allie's husband, Hugh, says to her when she says she wants to hire a private detective, he's an attorney, he goes, "Yeah, we use them. But usually we're using them to do surveillance, or somebody might be using them to do surveillance. How can you do surveillance because you're already back?" And so she says to the private detective, "How will you know where I was?" And he points out that right now there is so much closed circuit TV in New York City. We know places like London have that, but New York has a ton now. And so what he does is he says is you follow like a thread. We start with you showing up at Greenbacks. We talk the security people there into letting us see the tape or whatever it's called, and then we see you came from the south rather than the north, and then we start, and then we go to another building and see if we can find it, and you piece it together that way. I thought that was really interesting. I had no idea until I talked to this detective how they would go about it.
So basically, it's backtracking. It's kind of the reverse of the Indian scout.
Yeah, backtrack.
I love that. So a dissociative state or a fugue state. Is that mostly triggered from the research that you did? Is it mostly triggered by some sort of trauma, some kind of event?
Yes, definitely from trauma, often from abuse. In Allie's case, there's something that she discovered when she was younger, and it's had a lingering impact on her for a couple of different reasons you find out as you're reading, but it's definitely from trauma. When I was doing the book, I think in the back of my mind, what triggered the idea was a story that was in the papers in New York, maybe 6, 7 years ago, about a young woman who was found alive bobbing in the East River. And she'd had this very thing happen to her. She had no memory of where she was. She was a teacher. She hadn't showed up for the first day of school, but she had been seen on some security cameras in New York. And all of a sudden, she's in water. She was treated in a psych ward and went back to work, seemed fine, eventually moved to, I think, Virginia to live with her mother. Same thing happened again, and this time she was found in a stream. And they were fascinated because of the water connection in both cases. And the reason I know this added element to the story is that New Yorker did a great piece on this. And then, really tragically, a few years later, she was teaching in St. Thomas, and around there was one of the big hurricanes that came through. She went down to help some people and was never seen again. So the thinking was that somehow maybe she developed another fugue state and was swept away in the hurricane, but just a haunting story.
So they never got to the root of what it was that had caused this dissociative state to occur?
No, that in the New Yorker they talk about there must possibly was some trauma at some point, but it's not clear. And then interestingly, the big time fugue states that end up in novels don't happen frequently, but sometimes people do go through this in milder ways. And I was trying to find someone to help me with my research, and my one of my daughter's friends from high school is getting a PhD now. She's in her 20s, and she's a therapist. So I thought I'll at least ask her. And she goes, "Oh, that's my specialty." So I'm like, "Oh my gosh, hey, Lucy, I'm taking you out for dinner tonight, and you're going to tell me everything you know." So she was really helpful. And she read pages for me. And just the coincidence that this was her specialty as a therapist was great.
I liked the way, I think it was Kirkus reviews, but one of the reviewers said, um, because she's learned that she's made some bad choices, will recovering her memory start her on a quest to finding herself? And that's a really old form of fiction, and a valued one is the quest novel, the journey. And if it's a journey of
Right.
self-discovery, even better.
Yeah, and it turns out as Allie begins to explore things, she realizes there were things that she chose not to remember about this episode that happened to her when she was younger. And her realization of what those are make is a really important discovery for her and informs some of the big decisions she makes at the end of the book. And sometimes I plot out my books in advance. I'm not a pantser, as they say, one of those people who go by the seat of their pants, but something like that is really something that evolves as I'm writing the book. And it was interesting to see her have this moment of self discovery towards the end of the book.
I really liked it. Let me turn over here to Patrick for a moment and see if we have any questions. Patrick?
No, no real questions so far. Just a couple of people who've said that they've have read the book and have really enjoyed it. I've had one comment that a customer named Pat asks, "How do you find the time to engage with all your fans as much as you do?" She says you do a great job of interacting on Facebook and very responsive, and was just wondering how the heck you do it.
Patrick, I have to say that I started making sure I answered people who wrote in after they got my newsletter and right into Facebook I didn't know what a magical thing would happen, and that is these fantastic women and some men are just so great about answering a question I have about their lives, sharing what they're reading, what they're watching. And it is so enjoyable for me. I really make the time. And somebody wrote me the other day, I asked people how they were coping with the pandemic in my newsletter. And I got so many incredible answers and people talking about what they were going through. And this one woman said, "Thank you for walking into my life." And I thought, wow, I don't even know her, but she thinks of me walking into her life. And I feel these incredible women who read my books are so responsive on Facebook. I feel like they walked into mine and I know them a little bit. And it's become a big part of what I do is making sure I spend time every day responding. It's very gratifying. So to anyone who does that and takes the time to give a shout out, I just really enjoy it. And just so you know, it's me answering and not some assistant someplace.
I am not a robot. You can check here. I can tell you from my firsthand observation of what the pace of Kate's life was when she was um, at Cosmo that anything would be slower, and therefore she probably has more time in the way you measure time. You probably have more than you ever did before.
Barbara, what's interesting is when I was leaving Cosmo, I decided since I also wrote career books, and one of the first times I think I got together with you, we did something kind of maybe a little bit maybe related. One of the lunches was kind of related a little bit to that, but it was just me giving some thoughts or advice on that. I decided I would have this bifurcated life. I would write my career books and I would also do speaking around the country on leadership. And my boss had asked, what do you want for your going away present? And he said, you can pick something expensive. So I picked a very expensive class at Harvard Business School in leadership, their executive education program. And I went, and part of the program was that you had this team of people that helped you answer a professional question. And my professional question was, should I do only one of these two things? And everybody in the group, and there was a coach too, like your team was about six people, everybody said, okay, come on, it's so great you do both things. But the Turkish banker, because women came from all over the world, went, no, do just one of them. Well, I didn't follow her advice. I don't even remember her name, but about a year ago, I started thinking, I'm just going to do one thing. And giving my life over really totally to the suspense writing has been so great. And it's meant, yes, as you said, life was a little crazy in those days, and trying to do two things afterwards was crazy, but it's just been great to just have one thing to really focus on. So wherever you are, Turkish banker, thank you. I took your advice many years later, but I'm taking it now.
I should relate something that I think is apropos since I'm, as you know, about to turn 80. Somebody did a wonderful interview with Mary Higgins Clark, who sadly died this winter, but at the time was 89 looking at 90. And they asked her, if she was going to have a new book coming out next year, and she said, the gap between 89 and 90 is much larger than I thought. And I find myself slowing down slightly, just, age related. And, there is only so much time that you can do things and have the energy for. So part of that may simply be, this inevitable process that we're both going through.
Yes, absolutely. I feel like it's only yesterday you said to me, and I was shocked then, you said, I'm 70. And I was like, what? And now we know, Barbara, because you can't go to any dermatologist for fillers or Botox or anything. So we know you're absolutely incredibly gorgeous and youthful all on your own. It's not artificial, because this would be the moment we would figure it out.
That's very nice of you to say that. I had a long discussion with Hank Philippi Ryan, which is on our homepage at the moment, about the difficulties of coping with grooming at this particular time. And I loved her parting shot.
Oh,
She
my
said
God.
that the statistics are that there will be 80% fewer blondes at the end of this pandemic than there were at the start, which I think is just a great remark.
Yeah. I told my husband, I can't go to my orthodontist. I can't go to the dermatologist. I can't go to the colorist. I said it's going to be like the picture of Dorian Gray for you. You're going to look across the table one day and not recognize me.
Well, I do think that we're all very brave to be on Zoom, which is a fairly unforgiving, medium for where we are. But here it is. Any other comments, Patrick?
Not really.
Okay, then I'm going to ask you one final question, Kate, because one of the secrets of making this book work as well as it does is the pacing. You start out in this very difficult scene for her, and then as you move along, you have to plant clues both for her and for us as the reader. And I thought you did a terrific job. It never flattens out and you don't rush it. How did you manage that?
That's something I think all suspense authors are always working on. For me, I find it helps to constantly be rereading. And sometimes I'll even print out a chunk of the book and read it almost like a, a reader who reads print would read in an armchair to get a sense of the pacing. And I mentioned this to somebody I was talking to today, who's another suspense author, that I was reading in a magazine that I love called Writer's Digest. They just do some great stuff. I think it was there was they talk about, they might have like a whole article on pacing. And there was a romance writer who talked about, don't keep any aces up your sleeve. If you have the sense of like, hey, maybe I'll have the building catch on fire at one point, put it in now. Just don't wait. Just keep moving up the action. And by sort of thinking that way, I think it helps you stay at a pretty good boil with stuff. I mean, you like with a thriller movie, you want a little bit of downtime so that you give your reader a chance to stupidly relax before you surprise her with something. But you just want to keep that action coming, even if it's only kind of a type of action that's like psychologically scary. You just want to keep it coming.
Well, I thought you did a wonderful job. Now you're returning to Bailey for your next published book. Is that what you said?
No, I begged them. I just been loving the standalone, so I was supposed to, but I did another a standalone.
Okay.
And it's kind of locked house mystery, and it'll be out next spring.
Wonderful. Well, I have an idea.
Fortunately,
Maybe when we talk about it next spring, however we manage it, we could ask people to have finished reading this book. And then we could really talk about the way it resolves, because it's so interesting, but a total spoiler at the moment.
I would love that. And I'm so sorry not to be able to be out in Phoenix with you. And I just want to thank you so much for everything you do, Barbara. You have been such a incredible force in the genre, but you've also just been such a nice pal to me from the moment I met you, and I so appreciate it, and thank you for that.
It's been a real pleasure, Kate, and I will hope that by next spring we can actually sit down together. Meantime, thank you so much for this. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. And don't forget, we should have the books in from Kate probably by the end of the week or next Monday. So do place an order before we run out. Thank you.